Hi everyone, this is Helen with DMA, and this is another module that's part of your Move On strategy for the Eastern PA CoC. And this particular one is going to focus on the assessment and preparation phase of the Move On strategy. By the end of this module, you should know the goal of using on a Move On assessment, any important considerations, including engaging participants as this whole assessment is related to racial equity, and also using a trauma-informed approach. You should also know the scope of and how to administer the 2 assessments available to PSH providers in the Eastern PA CoC, and how to prepare a tenant for moving on, including making an informed decision about whether or not to move on at all. So first of all, when engaging participants around a moving on strategy, first and foremost, just be transparent. They should always know what their options are, the pros and cons. We don't want to necessarily lead them toward making up their minds for them at all. This is their choice. And remember some guiding principles of being voluntary, having choice, economic mobility, self-sufficiency, and long-term success. And along with being transparent, you're going to want to help set realistic expectations and ensure, or better ensure, that program participants and their case managers fully understand the opportunity as well as its implications. So to help with this process, we have developed 2 assessments. You will choose one of the 2, and there are certain goals of the assessment. And so first and foremost, using a fair and transparent, there's that word again, standardized assessment process to help remove any possibility for staff bias to influence which tenants are selected for moving on. The assessment should also make it as easy as possible for supportive housing program participants to access resources and move on when they wish to do so. And also it should ensure all system partners involved in moving on. So the housing authorities, the different providers, the CoC, or in this case, perhaps the RAB, that they work together efficiently and meet the needs of the move on participants. As always, and as with other processes related to CoC programming, it's really important to consider racial equity in the assessment process. So you should create an inclusive local leadership team for your Moving On initiative. We talked about creating this leadership team back in the general overview module, and include people with lived expertise, Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. So, really be intentional about inclusive of BIPOC. Co-create the Moving On application packet with people with lived experience and frontline staff from all stakeholders involved in the Moving On process. We create different aspects and templates for you to use so that you don't have to recreate the wheel. They're all available to you on the CoC website, but you're also going to probably want to make it your own. So please bring in those with lived experience and expertise when doing that. And you're going to want to ensure that the application is accessible in multiple languages as needed to meet the needs of PSH program participants in your community, or have the availability of a translator to do so. The CoC wants you to ensure that Moving On is being promoted to all tenants. Now, not everyone will choose to move on, and not everyone will necessarily be appropriate to move on at the time that it's introduced to them, but everyone should know it could be an option for them one day if they choose, and they get to a certain place in their tenancy where it seems to really make sense for them to move on from PSH. Okay, and then track tenant participation by race. If there are racial inequities in participation, investigate the causes with your local leadership team. DMA may be able to help with some analysis there. Make changes to locally established engagement strategies or the application packet and referral processes, and recommend changes to the CoC assessment, referral processes, etc., to make them more accessible and inclusive. Incorporating the voices of people with lived expertise and people of color. Okay, so what we have given you some tools to start with. They may not be the tools that you use forever and ever and ever. So if you're seeing that something really needs to be adjusted, we ask that you bring that to DMA's attention so that we could see about incorporating it across all the materials and across all of the different implementations in the CoC where it makes sense. So you're free to make those changes. Just talk to DMA first, just to ensure that we are all on the same page. And you're also going to want to train your staff on bias and structural racism. There is tons of training available to the CoC, your CoC already, available on the CoC website. So you're going to want to take a look at what already has been offered, and then, be on the lookout for related types of training to take advantage of in the future. Now, there is some pre-work that needs to be done before someone can just, be given the assessment to be, for moving on. There's some preliminary conversations and information that should really be shared with the tenant. So in addition to what you see here on the screen, just consider also that if you have a master leasing program, consider the pre-work you might also have to do with the landlord to shift from leasing with you to potentially leasing with the tenant, as some landlords may have concerns about losing the support from your organization. And then, if this can be accomplished, then the individual can transition in place. So some landlords may be more apprehensive about working with the housing authority. So the person is going to transition perhaps using a housing choice voucher. Then, that's something that you'll have to consider, that if the landlord would be more apprehensive of working with the PHA as opposed to your organization. So just keep that in mind, especially perhaps in terms of the housing authority having to do the assessment in terms of your own organization. So keep that in mind in addition to the other aspects that we have here on the screen. Okay, and it's really important that we understand and we're all on the same page with what the assessments are for. It's not paperwork just for the sake of filling out paperwork or, collecting data points for the sake of collecting data points. It's really to provide objective standards to guide discussions about what it takes to maintain housing stability without housing case management services and program supports. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no program supports. Someone might have a blended case manager or, a drug and alcohol counselor or whatever the case may be. But this is talking about housing specific case management as tied to PSH. And even if someone is not the most appropriate candidate for moving on, that doesn't mean that the assessment was a loss, because you can still use that as a case management tool to see where, there's still some gaps that need to be addressed. And so you're objectively reviewing a tenant's readiness to move on from supportive housing environment and maintain housing stability without housing case management program and supports. Helping the organization understand where their tenants are and where they need to provide more services in their organization. If assessment after assessment comes back that there's a certain gap in someone's kind of knowledge base, then that might be something where that needs to be more or better integrated into the PSH program delivery. And then the assessments can also assist with goal planning and case plan development, as I alluded to just about a minute ago. That said, there are some things that the assessments are not for. They are not to judge or to penalize a tenant. They are not to restrict tenant choice or pressure tenants who do not want to move on. They are not for ending move-on services or transition supports for some tenants. And they are not for labeling certain tenants as incapable of ever moving on from PSH. The assessment reflects a point in time for a tenant and should be completed multiple times throughout the program to help ascertain level of housing stability. So just because someone isn't ready at one point doesn't mean that they won't in another 6 months or whenever some kind of situation change or aspect changes in their situation. Here's some rules of thumb about administering the moving on assessment. They should be completed in partnership with tenants by case managers with knowledge and experience working with the household. Okay, it should not just be a stranger or someone that the household has had minimum experience with, just either filling it out based on their knowledge or handing it off to the household to complete on their own to be submitted at a later date. That is not the right way to go about doing this. Assessments must incorporate a detailed discussion about the tenant's ability and interest in moving on to other affordable housing options, because their preference here is really quite important. And this includes moving to a different type of unit, building, or neighborhood if applicable, awareness of and connection to mainstream community resources for ongoing support as needed. So initially someone might think that they need their housing case manager, but maybe they're not really fully aware of all of the resources that they have at their disposal, even without that housing case manager. So telling them objectively, like, these are what your options are, that's not swaying them in one way or the other. It's letting them make a more informed decision and not make decisions on false information or false impressions. As mentioned, assessments reflect a point in time for a household in their journey towards housing stability and should be completed multiple times throughout the program to help ascertain levels of need. And programs can use the assessment to assist with goal planning and case plan development from the onset of the project. So we touched on this earlier, but you could even do this from the very beginning of case management. This would be a great way to introduce the idea of moving on to someone so that they could see the types of things that come into play should they choose to move on in the future. Some things to keep in mind so that you can conduct, or your staff can conduct, with a trauma-informed approach. Okay, you can read these for yourselves, but I will touch on the highlights. Tenant empowerment, choice, collaboration, safety, and trustworthiness. Okay, all of these really must be incorporated when conducting the assessment. Building on the idea of informed choice, which was already touched on. The option of transitioning in place, if that is an option, versus moving into a new home. Letting them know what will be different and what will stay the same if they transition in place. Understand the difference between their current housing and prospective housing options, including the rent structure, expectations, etc. Are utilities included, not included? Understanding the housing market. If they're planning to move to a new home, they might need a list of needs, wants, and preferences. And then they might need to understand that some of their preferences, they might need to forego on some of those for the short term in order to find an affordable unit, perhaps in the location of their choice. Or maybe they give up the location of their choice so that they could get some of the amenities that they really want and that are important to them. It depends. It's going to have to be this ongoing conversation about what's going on in the market and what is feasible. Shared housing is also becoming more and more popular. Perhaps there is a shared housing program in your area. That might be something to look at as well. Okay, they're going to have to think about how their budget might change and the potential benefits of moving on. Now, it's quite possible that the assessment indicates that the tenant should really remain in supportive housing for some amount of time, especially if you're using this really early on in case management when you're working with someone. If that's the case, that's fine. This is how you should proceed. Frame this as an opportunity to help the tenant in the areas where the assessment indicates they need help. Do not frame it as a failure. It's an opportunity for growth and improvement. Provide targeted case management in the area that the tenant needs help in, and center tenant choice and a focus on supportive services to help the tenants who still wish to move on in the future to become ready for that next step. Okay, now the Eastern PA CoC, as was mentioned, has 2 moving on assessments to choose from. The PSH providers must adopt one of the 2 to implement consistently for your local moving on process. I mentioned that changes could be possible, but they must be brought to DMA's attention, and we need to talk about that before any kinds of changes are made. The 2 types of assessments are weighted and unweighted. The weighted is adapted from the Wisconsin Balance of State CoC, and the unweighted is adapted from the CSH moving on assessment. There are pros and cons to both. DMA looked at a wide variety of move on assessments from a cross-section of the United States and from organizations, and based on the fabric of the Eastern PA CoC, what we have heard is important to providers and participants. These are the 2 that were chosen, and they have been adapted to better meet the needs and priorities of the Eastern PA CoC. And the assessments are designed to determine which households are likely to maintain housing stability without a housing case manager and program supports. Okay? Let's talk about the 2. You're probably going to want to look at each of them in conjunction with each of these slides so you could really decide which is most appropriate for your area to implement, but we have them hyperlinked here. They are available on your CoC website. In terms of the weighted assessment, this one weights or assigns more points to housing stability and financial criteria. Recognizing that that's really where like the bulk of someone's responsibility falls when they are living on their own. So fewer points equals a higher level of stability. This assigns points according to a range of options within criteria. So pay attention to all of the options under each point value. It includes more flexibility in the financial criteria than the other assessment. It includes criteria related to harm reduction, health literacy, mobility and transportation, and communication. But since this is weighted, there is not as much weight assigned to those areas. There is criteria related to parenting and children in its own section for those whom it applies to. And interpretation of the scoring places greater emphasis on housing stability criteria, which is what we talked about with the weighted portion of this assessment. Okay, now looking at the unweighted assessment, also hyperlinked to your CoC website. It uses more restrictive financial criteria. Interpretation of the scoring requires yes responses to financial criteria questions. More points equal a higher level of stability. It does not weight or assign more points to housing stability criteria. Everything is kind of looked at the same. It includes criteria related to medication adherence, tenant goals, service utilization, and life skills. It embeds criteria related to parenting and children into the services and supports criteria as applicable. Okay, so different versions of assessments trying to achieve the same thing, which is trying to show who would be most appropriate for moving on. You might want to come up with maybe a couple of mock situations and see how they would play out to give you a better feel for each of the assessments before you decide on which one is really the one that you want to focus on in your area. All right, so if you did not look at the two assessments on those last two slides as we were talking about their differences, you could go ahead and pause the video and go do that now while it's fresh in your head, okay? And then you can continue for the last slide or two. All right, so we have talked about if someone is not ready to move on, but let's say you administer one of those two and someone is ready to move on. Here's what should happen. You should assist program participant with any housing subsidy or affordable housing applications, provide case management and or clinical support in terms of getting ready to move. Case management can be offered through CoC funding for 6 months beyond the time when the PSH rental assistance ends. It is a requirement that you offer the self-determination housing of PAs, Prepare Renter Education Program, also known as PREP, to participants to work on budget and other independent living skills. It also helps them on being a good neighbor. You should know that PREP is a train the trainer type module. So the case managers that will be doing PREP with the tenants, they will have to receive the training themselves from self-determination housing. Okay, SDHP does not train the tenants themselves. They train the caseworkers who will be training the tenants. It is free though, and they have moved to an online forum in terms of getting that training. More information on that in the services module. Okay, if someone is ready to move on and they are not transitioning in place, there should be some housing navigation provided and negotiations with the landlord if the participant wants to transition in place. Now, even if they don't want to transition in place and they're moving, there might need to be negotiations with landlord as well. So understand potential landlord concerns, their relationship with the housing authority and other systems, other dynamics that you might have to navigate in order to support participants, okay? Now with that wraps up the assessment portion and then like the really beginning stages of preparing tenants to move on. So if you have any questions, as always, please reach out to DMA through the CoC's email address, and thank you very much for watching.